Hello and welcome to week 16 of World History, where we are getting into a little deeper into the Age of Reason and sort of drifting a little further away from the Renaissance. A couple of lessons this week that will highlight two important factors in the formation of our nation. And one of those things we'll talk about in a minute, but one of those events where if it had gone differently, then our nation would possibly look a whole lot different today. We're going to first start talking about a person, a fellow by the name of Sir Walter Raleigh. He was an interesting character. He was a sort of a suck-up to Queen Elizabeth and used his charisma and his legendary reputation for flattery to stay in her good graces most of the time, and was able to put his mark on the New World too, modern-day North America. He grew up in Devonshire, England, and went to France at a very young age in terms of being an adult, because he went to the military. He wanted to fight. He wanted to seek glory. Well, he barely escaped. Remember the St. Bartholomew's Day massacre, where Catherine de' Medici had basically the Catholic soldiers murder every single Huguenot they saw in the city that day, and they almost did it. That horrible experience gave him a taste of the Reformation, and he did not like it very much. Understandable. Now, at this time, of course, we talked last week about Sir Francis Drake and the wink and a nod policy of Queen Elizabeth for her ship captains to disrupt Spanish commerce as much as possible, where if they're sort of like Mission Impossible, if you're captured, we will disavow any knowledge of you. Well, she never came out and told them, but it was known among the seafaring gentry that if you could make life terrible for Spanish galleons loaded with gold, Queen Elizabeth would be very, very pleased. And Sir Walter Raleigh began doing that. He got him a couple of ships and sailed and started making a name for himself, sort of as a pirate. Now, the contemporary literature of the time tells us that Walter Raleigh was 6 feet tall, which at the time was almost gigantic. Most historic accounts you read will tell you the average man was about 5'4", 5'5", weighed 150 pounds, so a 6 foot tall person would stand out quite a bit. On top of that, he was handsome, he was charming, he was quite the brown noser, I guess we could say. He lived to flatter Queen Elizabeth, and he did so with gusto to stay in her royal favor. He also began to look longingly across the Atlantic at some of the stories he was hearing about this so-called New World, and he, again, being an adventurous type, wanted to go there. He wanted to start an English colony in North America. As a matter of fact, the Queen agreed to sponsor his first expedition. It wasn't successful. They could never quite land on what's now the eastern United States, but he looked at the east coast of the New World and termed it Virgin Territory and named it Virginia in honor of the Virgin Queen, whom he flattered. I expect Elizabeth loved this, and of course, we live in Virginia today. Another voyage was planned by Walter Raleigh, but as it turned out, he didn't take part in this one directly. Elizabeth agreed to sponsor the trip, but only if Walter stayed home. Evidently, she liked him, not in a romantic way, but she was very flattered by him. And as it turned out, it was probably a darn good idea that he stayed in England. The expedition that he sponsored, but didn't lead, into the New World would become known as the Lost Colony. Now, I don't know how many of you are familiar with the story of the Lost Colony. I grew up with it because it happened very close by. It was one of the barrier islands of North Carolina. And so in terms of being a young history-curious dude, I learned as much I could about that. They hoped to establish a new home on what they called Roanoke Island off the coast of North Carolina. Today it's just south of Hatteras. Again, these barrier islands are very marshy, very small. and you are really at the mercy of the weather. Even today, if you live on the Barrier Islands, if Jim Cantore of the Weather Channel comes in on a hurricane forecast, you get the heck out of Dodge. You're very, very vulnerable out there. And of course, it's mainly sandy. It's not good for growing crops. But anyway, in 1587, 150 settlers left England for North America. 17 of them were women, and lo and behold, we had someone born, the first English person born in the New World. Her name was Virginia Dare, the first English baby born in North America. Now, the people, unfortunately, were not prepared for the harsh conditions of coastal life. Their governor, John White, who was also Virginia Dare's grandfather, decided it would be best to sail back to England for fresh supplies, better provisions, a few more healthy people. This turned out to be a terrible choice. The year he returned to England was the year of the Spanish Armada, 1588. We'll be talking about that in just a second. Because of the war, he was forbidden to sail back to North America. It would be 3 years before John White could return to Roanoke Island with provisions. When he finally made it back in the year 1590, there was nobody there. There was not signs of a struggle. There were no bodies. And there was nothing to indicate that anything untoward happened. They just disappeared. No signs of a struggle. The only things they found were 2 carvings on a tree. One read Croatoan. The other only read Crow, C-R-O. Some think the short inscription implies that the settlers were overcome by the Croatoan Indians who lived actually in what's now mainland North Carolina, but frequently got out to the islands for fishing or whatever. Others believe the settlers went to live voluntarily further inland with the Croatoans, who by all accounts were not a very militant tribe. One bit of evidence seems to support this theory. Some descendants of the Croatoan have blue eyes, light hair, and English names. It could be that there's truth to that theory. Again, to me, that seems the more plausible. It seems as if they were massacred by the Croatoans, there would have been some sign of a struggle there. Some of the bodies they would have left there. I know after 3 years, there would be some decomposition, but there was not a shred of evidence of anyone being there. So the Lost Colony, you can go to the Outer Banks of North Carolina and see a very well put together play to talk about this, one of the more fascinating mysteries of history. Meantime, in England, Sir Walter Raleigh, still flattering Queen Elizabeth, he made a mistake. He actually fell in love with another woman, a woman named Elizabeth Throckmorton. The problem was she was one of Queen Elizabeth's royal maids. And so in secret, Walter married his sweetheart. Elizabeth, of course, found out about it and was very upset. No one from her court was allowed to marry without her permission. This was very much a breach of royal etiquette. So what did she do? Elizabeth locked the couple up in the Tower of London. Walter wrote a flattering letter to the Queen, and in short order was released. In time, his wife was too, though she obviously lost her job as a maid in Elizabeth's court. Sir Walter Raleigh still had his zest for adventure. In 1595, he sailed to South America in search of the legendary city of El Dorado, the city of gold, according to the legends. And that's exactly what they were. How many times have we told you that the natives would trick the newcomers and say, "Oh yeah, there's a city of gold right over there, about 500 miles away. All you got to do is get there. Yeah, just go, 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 go." Anyway. Of course, he did not find El Dorado. In 1596, he went back to Ireland, and this is important. He introduced to them the potato. In case you didn't know, potatoes are to Ireland what corn is to Iowa. And despite the stroke of genius, though, Raleigh became very much in debt. He also brought tobacco back to Europe. The first time Europeans had been smoking stuff for centuries, obviously, but this type of tobacco was very much favored among the English, and so he started a small industry there, and of course it grew to the point where for 400 years it was the #1 cash crop in Virginia. Now, Sir Walter Raleigh's adventuring was about to come to a sudden end because Elizabeth died, the year 1603. Her cousin James VI of Scotland became king. He was Catholic, whereas the Queen was Protestant, and he had no attachment whatsoever to Sir Walter Raleigh. And so Raleigh was actually condemned for treason, and once again he found himself locked up in the Tower of London. While there, he spent an amazing 13 years in the prison. The king just wanted him out of the picture. He evidently didn't have any specific animus towards him. He was a very privileged prisoner. His wife and son were allowed to live with him in a small home. He was given books, experiments, servants. It was a comfortable prison, but it was still a prison. He eventually schemed his way out, and he promised King James that if he sponsored a trip to South America rather, he would find gold. He was released, oddly enough, and allowed to lead that expedition to South America on one condition. He and his men were not to touch the Spanish or any of their territories. James was trying to seek peace at this time with Spain, and he did not want anything else to spark a war. Well, Walter's men couldn't keep their hands off the Spanish. During in Bolivia, I believe it was, they began attacking the Spanish, and in the resulting gunfire, Sir Walter Raleigh's son was shot and killed. When he returned to England, he knew he was a dead man. King James scolded him for violating the conditions and ordered his execution. His wife lived 29 more years in England, but the story of Walter Raleigh, fascinating. Tobacco and potatoes, what he introduced to Europe coming from the New World, and his introductions, whether or not he realized them, formed the basis of two very lucrative cash crops, which would encourage more investment. Now, we've talked about a lot of things the past 2 or 3 weeks having to do with the Spanish Armada and England's defeat of the Armada in 1588. We're now going to finally talk about it. We're kind of jumping around chronologically here, but this was a pivotal point in history because of what happened after that. And of course, given the timeline, this is 1588. In 19 years after this event, the English, not the Spanish, would establish the first permanent colony in North America at Jamestown. For decades, serious rivalry between England and Spain. They were sort of the two superpowers in that part of the world. You'll remember a lot of the animosity actually goes back to Henry VIII, his divorce of Catherine of Aragon. She was a Spanish princess, very Catholic, and the Spanish Catholics never forgave England for that. It was very humiliating. Of course, there was also the very awkward marriage of convenience between Bloody Mary of England and Philip II of Spain. They never had any children, so it never went anywhere in terms of a line of succession. Of course, Philip, as we talked about last week, was already in trouble with the Netherlands for being very, very oppressive towards the Protestant population there. Philip courted Elizabeth, like just about every other Tom, Dick, and Harry in Europe did, evidently. And he wanted to try to stay in her good graces, but the tensions were rising. Conflict was inevitable. Lots of things would ultimately disrupt the peace. Of course, Sir Francis Drake, given wink and a nod permission to plunder every Spanish ship he saw. Elizabeth was very open about helping the Dutch in their struggle with Spain. And finally, you'll recall Elizabeth had Mary, Queen of Scots, executed in 1587. Spain had hoped that Mary would someday take the throne of England and restore Catholic rule there. All these events added together reached critical mass, and Philip finally decided he had to take military action against England, and he did. He sent pretty much his entire navy, his armada, they called it, to attack Great Britain. Elizabeth very famously rode out before her troops and gave a noble speech before the Spanish arrived. And Philip II, again, we talked a lot about him. He's been made out to be the bad guy in a lot of our stories, and yeah, he did some very bad things. The oppression of the Protestants in the Netherlands. But you got to keep in mind, he was very, very popular in Spain. He was a devout Catholic. He actually lived almost like a monk. He did not live in a castle. He lived in a very simple residence near the castle. And he truly believed that his calling in life was to protect the Roman Catholic Church. So, while this is not specifically a battle between Protestantism and Catholicism, it is. Those two religions or two sects were fueling this international dispute. Again, it was not exactly the church directly intervening in something, but the religious undertones were all over this confrontation between England and Spain. Spain sent their invincible armada towards the coast of England in May of 1588. 130 ships, 2,500 guns, 30,000 men. Almost 200 of them were priests and friars who viewed war against England as, again, their holy calling. They were not only fighting for Spain, they were fighting for the Roman Catholic Church, which was, of course, very much diminishing in England. The English, on the other hand, had a small navy of only 82 warships, a little more than half than the Spaniards, and a good chunk of them were not really warships. They were fishing boats, merchant vessels, but they were quick. The Spanish galleons that they sent into war were humongous ships, and they would just run aground into other ships, throw grappling hooks, board the ships, kill the men, and that's how they operated. The British ships, though, were simply too fast, and they were much like, okay, we're not going to get into a direct confrontation with these monstrous ships. We're going to outflank them, outmaneuver them. Quite often, the shots fired from the Spanish ships went over the British ships. The Spanish hoped to lure the English out to open sea for a battle, a one-on-one, mano-a-mano. The British said, no, we're not going to do it that way. You're going to fight in this narrow English channel, separating England from the European mainland. The fighting went on for several days. The Dutch actually played a role in this by clogging up Spanish reinforcements from heading in from the Netherlands. The Dutch had a very effective navy, and they sort of kept Spain from bringing their right hand back around into this fight. The biggest part of this series of conflicts, about a week and a half, was when the English, Sir Francis Drake, set fire to 8 small tar-covered vessels and sailed them directly into the Armada. The Spanish, a few ships caught fire. Most of them fled towards the coast of France, and the English fleet poured all their firepower into the Armada as soon as they had them in a vulnerable position. The Armada lost about 4,000 men. More were wounded, and the Spanish began retreating. They were forced to sail north around the Great British Island, and by the time they hit the coast of Ireland, 17 more ships. Only 54 ships made it back to the harbor in Spain. Out of the 30,000 Spaniards, only 10,000 of them survived. History was changed because of this. It instantly helped the Dutch gain their independence. It gave also strength to the Protestant cause in England and pretty much solidified England's future as a predominantly Protestant nation. It also opened the door for British colonization of North America. Some say, and I think that it's obvious, that there would be far more Spanish and Roman Catholic influence in this new world had the Spanish Armada not been stopped that year. Suffice to say, before 1588, most of the significant colonization of the New World had been done by Spain and Portugal. After 1588, the most significant colonization came from England. And it was the British, of course, who established the colony at Jamestown, later the colony at Plymouth, Massachusetts. We're going to close out this week talking about a writer, not a great warrior, not a king or queen or, great religious authority, someone who was just a writer who used a style that people immediately identified with, and it is still probably, if you were to ask most people, the most preferred style of writing even to this day. His name was Michel de Montaigne. He spent years writing personal essays. He was a skeptical curmudgeon, which puts him in my good graces already. Of course, he grew up in France during the time where the wars between the Catholics and the Huguenots were killing thousands. And again, this, as much as anything else, gave him a distaste in general for religion. He had a very unique education. He came from a well-to-do family, so he was educated. But part of his education was to, how can we say this, learn through experience. Don't just keep your nose in a book. Go out and experience stuff. Learn stuff on your own. Learn lessons that you'll never forget because you experienced them firsthand. So an interesting educational background led to an interesting view. He began by studying law, quickly realized that was far too tedious from him. He also had a good friend of his die in college, and he, to his, I mean, by his own words, he never really got over that. This is a real good friend. And he retired from a short career in government in 1571 and began just writing. He isolated himself in his home for about 10 years. His inward journey resulted in a series of his writings titled essays. Now, this is a form of writing he used called the personal essay. It doesn't seem so weird to us because we're used to reading this style of writing most of the time. Most of the written literature that you could access at this point, 1570s, late 1600s, late 16th century, the Bible, of course, being the most popular, but others were, histories, academic, things like that, some poetry, but the personal essay where someone just sits down and writes their thoughts and views. Now, it's not foreign to us. I mean, we've got bloggers today, people on Facebook like me who, type up opinion pieces. Oh, we're used to that. But De Montaigne was one of the first to get people interested in that. He was not the first to write an essay style. Plato, Cicero, Marcus Aurelius, they did that. But De Montaigne, first of all, unlike them, he was not a great leader. He was not in a position where if he writes something, people are going to read it. He was just a regular guy. But this style of writing fascinated people, and it made him some money, no doubt about it. He explored the depths of topics as they related to himself. So it was a very personal essay. Here's how I view this. Here's what I think. Here's what I see. And if you're a king and tell people your opinion, that's one thing. If you're just a regular Joe and you tell somebody your opinion, most of the time they don't listen. But they listen with De Montaigne because this style of writing was very personal, very direct. He wrote in the first person. He wrote as though the person he's talking to is right next to him. Very personal, and it's an engaging writing style. As he called it, livelier than a textbook or an encyclopedia, and a far better tool for learning. And I've been in news writing for some time, and you think news writing is just the facts. No, it's still narrative form. He gained a reputation as a skeptic. It wasn't much he believed in, but a lot he didn't believe in. He was he found it hard to believe, religion very hard to believe. He also didn't believe love had to do with marriage. He says marriage should be for financial convenience. Very skeptical towards education. Again, he had a very unusual background in his learning, and he thought keeping your nose in a book is not the best way to learn. Again, skeptical towards religion. He had seen, and of course, it would be very difficult to grow up and witness the bloodshed that was coming in the name of religion on all sides at that time. Be very difficult not to have at least a jaundiced view of it. The Age of Reason, though, on the rise, and Montaigne fed off this mindset, which turned attention away from God and towards the self. He seemed uncertain of absolutes. He was very distrustful of people who claimed to have knowledge of everything, of the way everything should be. Again, his writing style was very popular, and pretty soon, within a century of this, the vast majority of written communication was done in essay narrative style. So hats off to De Montaigne. We'll talk more about it Monday. Have a great weekend.